Music. In Georgia, the rise of peonage. After the Civil War, slavery was officially abolished in the decades that followed. Yet, a darker reality remained hidden in states like Georgia. By the early 20th century, thousands of African Americans were trapped in a system called peonage. Desperate to keep their farms and lumber mills profitable, landowners found ways to replace the chains of slavery. They used false debts, fraudulent contracts, and threats of violence. If they were found walking without proof of employment, poor black men, many of them recently freed or born to freed parents, were accused of so-called vagrancy. Often bribed, local sheriffs arrested them and handed them directly to landowners. A steady stream of workers was needed for Georgia's cotton fields and sawmills, and peonage provided a cruel solution. Real wages were never paid to the workers. Instead, they were told they owed money for tools, food, or shelter. They could never leave, insured by this endless debt. By 1921, the shadow of forced labor still covered places like Savannah, Atlanta, and the surrounding counties. Even as America claimed to be moving forward, it was within this world that men like John S. Williams operated. They kept hidden camps of enslaved workers far from the eyes of the law, yet deeply tied to the economic power of the South. Introduction of John S. Williams. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. John S. Williams was no ordinary farmer. From Jasper County, Georgia, he was a wealthy landowner controlling wide stretches of farmland and lumber operations. Known in local circles as a man of influence, Williams maintained a public image of respectability. Yet, behind the walls of his property, he was running one of the most notorious peonage camps of his time. Through deception and corruption, Williams recruited laborers. Many men came from nearby towns like Monroe, Augusta, or Savannah, seeking honest work after the hardships of World War I. They found themselves trapped instead of finding wages. By arresting black men under vagrancy charges and delivering them to his farms, local authorities, especially sheriffs and deputies, helped Williams. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. More than a business, Williams' farm was a prison without bars. From dawn until dark, workers were forced to cut timber for the sawmills, harvest crops, and perform backbreaking labor. Directly tied to the suffering of these men was the economic growth of Georgia's lumber industry. By 1921, Williams had become both wealthy and deeply paranoid. A constant fear that the truth would one day surface was created by his reliance on illegal labor. And when investigators began closing in, his story would take a turn from exploitation to mass murder. Recruitment through deception. By the year 1921, many black men in Georgia were still living in poverty, searching for stable work in fields, lumber yards, or railroad construction. This desperation was exploited by recruiters and landowners like John S. Williams. They spread word of well-paying jobs in farming or timber, often promising room, food, and steady wages. With hope for a better life, men who left their homes in towns like Savannah or Augusta soon discovered that these promises were lies. Others were not even given the illusion of choice. To target young black men who had no written proof of employment, corrupt law enforcement officials, especially sheriffs and deputies in rural counties, used vagrancy laws. A man simply walking along a road could be arrested and fined. Since most were too poor to pay the fine, they were handed over to landowners like Williams. Under another name, this system allowed slavery to continue, protected by local authorities who shared in the profits. The deception ended once a man was taken to Williams' farm. Meaningless were the so-called contracts, and debts were fabricated to keep the workers bound. New charges were added for each day they worked, tools, food, clothing, ensuring they would never be free. Some were locked in makeshift cabins. Others were watched by armed overseers. Fear replaced hope. And the men quickly realized that the job they had accepted or the arrest they had suffered was a trap leading to slavery. Conditions of captivity. Brutal and unforgiving was life on the Williams farm in Jasper County. With little more than straw on the ground for bedding, the workers, mostly young black men, were held in wooden shacks. Scarce was food, often just cornmeal or scraps, never enough to sustain men who labored from dawn until nightfall. From nearby creeks, water was taken, muddy and unsafe, leaving many constantly sick and weak. Relentless was the labor itself. Men were forced to cut heavy logs for the lumber industry, load wagons, and clear farmland. In chains or under the watchful eyes of armed guards, they worked. Swift punishment brought any attempt to resist or slow down. Common were whippings, and beatings with clubs or gunstocks left men scarred and broken. Nearly impossible was escape. Isolated was the farm, surrounded by woods and rivers. Even if someone managed to slip away, local authorities often returned escapees to Williams, claiming they still owed debts. As disposable, the men were treated, their lives valued only for the labor they could give. By 1921, conditions on Williams's farm mirrored slavery of the previous century. Yet, it was even more hidden, operating in the shadows of a modernizing America. While cities like Savannah and Atlanta pushed forward with industry and culture, in the countryside, men were chained to logs, beaten into submission, and forced to live as if emancipation had never happened. A chilling reminder that freedom had not reached every corner of Georgia was the cruelty of captivity at Williams's camp. Growing pressure in 1921. By the beginning of 1921, whispers about illegal slavery were spreading across Georgia. Both black communities and sympathetic reformers in cities like Savannah and Atlanta received reports of men disappearing from towns and never returning. Into peonage in the South, the federal government had already launched investigations and journalists were starting to publish stories about forced labor hidden in plain sight. Although local sheriffs often turned a blind eye, the national climate was shifting. Only a few years earlier, World War I had ended and African American veterans had come back from Europe demanding the rights and dignity they had fought for abroad. Also in motion was the Great Migration, with thousands of black families leaving the South for cities like Chicago and Detroit, escaping the brutality of Jim Crow. Against this backdrop, illegal slavery in Georgia looked increasingly indefensible. Because men arrested for vagrancy frequently vanished after being sent to his farm, Williams' operations drew suspicion. Letters searching for missing sons and brothers were written by families. Activists in Savannah and Atlanta pushed for inquiries, and federal agents began to watch the region more closely. Hints of corruption and brutality tied to peonage camps were carried by newspapers, raising fears among landowners who relied on such systems. For John S. Williams, this growing pressure was dangerous. He understood that if even one of his workers escaped and testified, his entire empire could collapse. At risk were his wealth, his reputation, and even his freedom. This fear pushed him toward decisions that would turn his crimes into one of the most shocking episodes in Georgia's history. Fear of exposure. As scrutiny mounted in early 1921, John S. Williams's confidence gave way to fear. For years, he had operated with a sense of impunity, protected by corrupt officials and the silence of rural isolation. But with federal agents probing into cases of peonage and reporters asking questions about missing workers, the walls began to close in. Williams realized that his forced labor camp could no longer remain hidden. Living evidence of his crimes were the men he held, and their testimonies could destroy him in court. Not only charges for illegal slavery, but also potential ruin of his reputation did he face. As a respectable landowner in Jasper County, for someone accustomed to wealth and power, exposure was unthinkable. With each rumor, the paranoia grew stronger. Williams feared that one of the laborers might escape, reach Savannah or Atlanta, and tell the world what was happening on his farm. He knew that black workers, if given the chance to speak freely, would describe chains, beatings, and starvation. Details that would ignite outrage, even in a nation accustomed to racial violence. Instead of releasing the men, Williams convinced himself that freedom for them meant destruction for him. His logic twisted. Only if the men never lived to tell their story could silence be guaranteed. By February, his fear had hardened into a deadly plan. What began as exploitation would soon turn into murder on a scale that shocked even those familiar with Southern brutality. The decision to kill. By February of 1921, John S. Williams' fear had turned into desperation. Investigators were circling closer, and he knew that keeping the workers alive meant risking exposure. Living witnesses were the men who toiled on his property. If even one escaped, the truth about chains, whippings, and false debts would be revealed. Williams convinced himself that silence was the only way to survive. Suddenly, the decision did not come. It grew from weeks of mounting pressure. With his trusted overseers, men who had long enforced the brutality on his farm, Williams spoke. Together they considered their options. Freeing the workers would leave them free to talk. Keeping them confined carried the danger of discovery. In Williams's mind, there was only one path left: eliminate them entirely. He believed that by destroying the men in his custody, he could erase the evidence of his crimes. More to him than human lives seemed his wealth, land, and status. To Williams, these black men were not seen as people, but as potential threats. Shaped by the same racism that had allowed slavery to persist in the South long after abolition, his calculations were cold. Clear was the order he gave. Dispose of them one by one or in groups, and ensure no trace could point back to the farm. What began as a system of forced labor now escalated into mass murder. Not accidental, but deliberate was the transition from exploitation to killing. A plan crafted by a man desperate to protect his own power. The 11 murders. In the cold days of late February 1921, the killings began. Williams's overseers carried out his orders, taking groups of workers away from the farm under the cover of night. In the span of just a few days, 11 men in total would lose their lives. Brutal were their deaths, planned not for cruelty alone, but for silence. Some were beaten and chained before being driven to rivers. To their bodies, heavy rocks were tied, ensuring they would sink beneath the water. Others were shot or bludgeoned, their corpses dragged to swamps where Williams believed nature would hide the evidence. With chilling precision, each murder was carried out. For their employers' fear, overseers acted as executioners. The victims were not nameless. They were sons, brothers, and husbands who had come seeking work. Many were still young, in their 20s or 30s, filled with the hope of building lives despite the obstacles of Jim Crow. Instead, their trust was betrayed and their bodies were thrown into rivers like the Yellow River in Jasper County, swallowed by the dark waters of Georgia's countryside. Williams thought the murders would erase the danger. To him, killing these 11 men was a final act of control, cutting off every possibility of testimony. But rivers do not keep secrets forever. Within days, bodies began to resurface, chains and rocks still clinging to their remains. Instead of the silence Williams sought, national outrage would explode as the story of the 11 murders shocked Georgia and the entire country. Discovery and outrage. That the rivers and swamps of Jasper County would swallow the truth was believed by Williams. But nature betrayed him. Within days of the killings in February 1921, bodies began to surface. Corpses entangled in chains weighted down with rocks were noticed by fishermen and locals along the Yellow River and Alcovy River. Horrifying was the sight. Men tied like cargo, left to rot in the waters. Quickly through nearby towns from Monticello to Savannah, word spread. Immediate suspicion was sparked by the discovery. These were not random deaths, but deliberate killings. What had long been whispered could no longer be ignored by authorities, that peonage camps were operating in Georgia under the cover of respectability. An explanation, though a tragic one, was finally had by families who had written desperate letters about missing sons and brothers. Immense was the grief. But so was the anger. The story was seized by newspapers. Headlines described the gruesome details, shocking readers not only in Georgia but across the nation. That 11 black men had been murdered to conceal slavery in 1921, a time when America claimed to be modern and democratic, was nearly unbelievable. For African American communities, it was confirmation of what they had long endured, that emancipation had not brought true freedom. Investigators were forced to act by public outrage. On Jasper County, state officials descended, questioning overseers and examining the Williams farm. The chains, the deaths, and the beatings all came into focus. What had been hidden in rural isolation was now impossible to conceal. Instead of silencing the truth, the murders had exposed it to the world. Trial and historical impact. Soon arrested was John S. Williams. His name now synonymous with brutality. One of the most extraordinary in Georgia's history was the trial that followed. For the first time, a white landowner of wealth and influence stood accused of murdering black men to conceal slavery. With spectators, reporters, and community members eager to witness whether justice would prevail in the Jim Crow South, courtrooms in Covington and later Monroe filled. Overwhelming was the evidence. About carrying out Williams's orders, overseers testified. Those used on his farm matched the chains and weights recovered from the rivers. Clothing and personal belongings were identified by families of the victims. As a man who valued property and reputation above human life, prosecutors painted Williams. That he was protecting himself from false accusations was tried by his defense to argue. But little room for doubt was left by the scale of the killings. In a historic verdict, Williams was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. For killing black men, it was the first time in Georgia that a white man received such a sentence. Though many expected him to escape punishment, the sheer brutality of the crime forced the system to act. Lasting was the impact. The reality that slavery had not ended in practice, only changed its form, was exposed by the case. Across the nation, people read about the Williams murders and understood that peonage was still alive in the South. While Williams's conviction did not erase the system overnight, it marked a turning point. It showed that even in a society built on racial inequality, the truth could no longer be buried under rivers and swamps.